So without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker, our farmer presenter. So Steve Sickle and his wife Amanda operate Sickle Farms, a beef and cash crop farm, in addition to a custom work operation close to St. George in Brant County, Ontario. In 2019, Sickle Farms received the Beef Farmers of Ontario Environmental Stewardship Award. Steve's always been an ambassador for soil and water conservation on his farm, practices that began with his father Bill in the 1970s and 80s, and which he continues to improve on today. So Steve, we're gonna start it off by getting a virtual tour from Steve and the cover crop grazing he's been doing with his cow herd. So we're gonna start that video up, and afterwards we're gonna hear a short presentation from Steve himself.
Steve Sickle on the home farm here. Rotation of 5-year rotation of corn, soybeans, and wheat. Corn, soybeans, wheat to make that 5-year rotation. So trying to graze the cows pretty well year round. Last year I was successful. I only had to feed hay for 45 days, plus another 20 days because of the drought we had last year. This year we had an inch of rain in August, so I had to feed hay for 2 weeks. And now the cows have weaned, and then they're weaned, and now the cows are back out on cover crop. And I'm surprised how well this cover crop looks for having that little bit of rain in August. Started to grow some black beans recently, so that gets some earlier wheat in, and then earlier wheat harvested, which means an earlier cover crop, so more feed for the cows. And then we're spreading cereal rye after corn and after soybeans that doesn't go to wheat. So I'm grazing that as well. This past year I was able to turn the cows back out the 25th of March on the cover crop. So that really extended my grazing season after the cows had calved. I booted the cows out that had already calved. I calved March, April. So then the cows that had calved got booted out. The ones that hadn't calved stayed in the barn just so I could monitor them a little easier because I'm busy on the land. I'm a one-man show basically. Other than my daughter, she moves the cows. She's 17 and my son's 10. They're the ones that look after the cows for the most part, other than calving. So when it comes to my cover crop history, I guess Dad's always cover cropped. We always had red clover after wheat. I remember walking with Dad as a kid with the hand seeder putting red clover on wheat. Then we thought we had it made when he had a 3-wheeler and put the seeder on the back of that. But recently I've had bad luck with red clover. So I transitioned to oats and peas and drilling it, and that was 100% success versus half success or no success after wheat. And my aha moment, I guess, was when I had Soil Smart up at Rim Park with Ray Archuleta. And when he told us about mimicking the forest with our farmland and having roots in the ground year round, it kind of hit me. I always knew my corn after a hayfield was the best corn. And it was always told to us, oh, it's the nitrogen credit. It's like, when Ray said that, it's like, no, it's not nitrogen credit. That's the roots in the ground year round for 3 or 4 years of the alfalfa in the rotation. It's like, okay, we need to mimic that in our cash crop. So get rye after soybeans or rye after corn. And I've seen a great transition just in a big rain. We capture more rain. There's no runoff off my hills. I've got lots of 20% slopes here on this farm and lots of ground that I farm. I would say we almost have no soil movement now. The grassed waterways we had of the past are gone. We don't need them. And my soil now, if we tile a farm and we have to cultivate those tile runs, the soil looks black. It looks like potting soil. The guy that filled my silo the other day, we filled silo after 0.8 of an inch of rain, filled silo the next day. We weren't making tracks. We weren't picking up mud on the tires. And the guy filling the silo, he's on the soil health journey too. And he says, this is proof that soil health works. And my crop yields are maintaining what they were back in the day when we were plowing. But my cost of production, I would say, is the same, but I'm not using the chemical or the fertilizer, but it's going towards cover crop seed. And my soil health is way better. And I'm not spending money on hay. So now my feed for the cows it's not free, but it seems free. And my soil health is benefiting it. So this winter wheat was harvested July 20th. We had lots of rains to get the volunteer wheat that was thrown out the back of the combine going. There was lots of shrunken kernels because of the drought we had. So I have to spray my wheat stubble before the cover crop comes up. It has to be, because there's way too much competition from volunteer wheat. It gives you a chance to get your annual weeds and fleabane. So my recipe is Roundup and Aragon to control that, because this will not get sprayed again until after it's planted to corn next summer. So that's my one time to get that stuff controlled. If you don't spray and your volunteer wheat gets going, I think you're wasting your time, because there's way too much competition from that volunteer wheat on your cover crop, and your volunteer wheat has a head start. So then this was no-tilled August 4th with a no-till drill, and I believe I sprayed it I sprayed it before I planted it. And that got planted. It's about 50 pounds, 60%, total of 50-pound mix, 60% oats, 30% peas, there's a couple pounds of turnip in there, there's a little bit of old corn seed in there, a little bit of old soybean seed in there. I think there's a bag over the whole 60 acres, and same as of beans and corn. It got 60 pounds of dry fertilizer as well. I've got dry fertilizer on my Deere no-till drill. And that was a half MAP, half potash mix. Every time I'm going over the field with a drill, I want to put some fertilizer down. It gives me an opportunity to bring my fertility level, or maintain some fertility levels. Then 2 weeks ago, or mid-September, this got 5 tons of a dry layer manure. I have access to chicken manure, so that's my nitrogen source. My cover crop that doesn't have chicken manure applied yet, it looks light yellow, and it's not half the size of this. It needs some nitrogen, it needs some help. But I haven't got it spread yet because it got too wet, and I want to spread it ahead of a rain event to incorporate the nitrogen and save the neighbors' noses. So here we are standing in about 3 feet of cover crop, one of the better spots of the field, nice wide leaves, lots of oats. You can see by the cows' preference, they've attacked the oats pretty hard, left everything else, but they will come back and graze the peas, and then eventually get a taste for the turnip that's in the bottom. And they'll graze those turnip right through into January. Even when the ground's froze, they'll get those suckers out of the ground. So there's 25 animals here. I've got them on about 20 acres. Because of the size of this field, this is the first time I've limited how much they're getting. My plan is to have them on here for about 3 weeks, give them another 20 acres. If the corn stalks are ready, then I'll pull them off of this and put them on corn stalks after it's been combined, because I like to eat that while it's fairly fresh. I figure it deteriorates quicker than this stuff will. And then they'll come back to here in January, and I should be able to get grazing right through to the end of January is my plan, maybe partway through February. So there is a little bit of buckwheat in here, a little bit of hairy vetch as well, only a pound to the acre. Some soybeans here, they're at R1, got some pods on them. They'll be palatable as well. But these cows are as happy as can be. They won't push fence as long as they got lots of feed. So the last 2 years since I've been really managing this for grazing, my cover crop that is, I'm getting manure flaps on my planter when I'm planting corn or beans. So the day of planting, the cows come off the field, and I'll plant right into that with my no-till planter. And then terminate that when there's a little bit of regrowth before my crop comes up with a Roundup, Aragon, and Converge, because Converge is the safest for coming back with cover crop, whether in crop or after the crop. Acuron I find is a little too, I've never used Acuron, but what I'm hearing, it's a lot heavier for residual, so my cover crop timing doesn't work that well. And I'm finding that my weeds are suppressed. I don't have the weed competition now with cover crop, because this is my weed. I'm getting my Roundup and Aragon after the wheat, so that's controlling a lot of my annuals. And the cows are grazing it hard, so it doesn't have a chance to put down lots of root in the fall, and my weed spectrum seems to be a lot smaller. So having the cows out here on cover crop this time of year, I've just spent the last 3 weeks feeding the cows every day, because we were dry. And then part of my weaning program is lock the cows in the yard, feed them for a week while the calves are still on the pasture that they're used to. They have nose-to-nose contact. It's no fun starting a tractor and feeding a bale of hay. I'd rather sell that bale of hay than feed it to my cows. So And you don't get the carbon penalty. You grow that cover crop or no-till soybeans after corn stalks. You put the cows on those corn stalks, you're getting that carbon turned into manure. You don't have that carbon penalty in your soybeans. And your soybeans where you've got those cows are your best beans, by far. And the hooves are tillage. I've wanted to graze the cows on some neighbors' corn stalks. He said, no, I'm gonna work the corn stalks. It's like, no, the cows are gonna work those corn stalks and they're gonna remove that carbon and turn it into manure. Way quicker than if you worked it. And at no cost. Maybe even an income. So I don't see any detriment from compaction when it's muddy. When I do feed the cows, I do move the feeder every day, but it's not the cows effect that I see, it's that tractor track that I see if I'm feeding in a January thaw, so to speak. Now I've changed my plan. If we do have a January thaw and I do have to feed cows, I'll feed a couple small squares or break open a big square and spread it out so the cows aren't congregated and I don't have to run that tractor across the field when it's thawed out and wet.
Okay, so now I'm going to invite, there you go, Steve, you can share your screen now, Steve, and bring your slides up, and we're going to hear a little bit more from you.
Well, thanks, James. That was an excellent video. I feel like I can just go home. I am home. So this is the cows in the end of March on cereal or wheat stubble cover in the foreground, and then beyond that fence is cereal rye where we filled silo from at about 6 acres. The rest of the field was cereal rye, not quite as thick, where we'd combined. So just the cows and calves that had calved got booted out, and that was about half the herd, and it just saves manure spreading, saves just a lot of work, less bedding, and the barn's not as crowded. Now this year was a different year in that we were able to do that. Every winter's different when you pull the pin of when the ground's fit enough to boot cows out. So this is the same field that James had in his presentation of our front hill that's fairly steep. We were able to maintain soil on that hill. We've got quite a few slopes on a lot of my ground that even isn't pastured. I'm used to farming hills, but we're able to maintain soil health and keep that soil on the hills. And these little step-in posts, that's what we've got here along the lane. Newborn calves don't seem to be a problem. It's when the calves get a little bigger and more venturesome that can be a challenge to keep them off the road. So once cover crops needing to be removed and get planted to a cash crop, then the cows are rotationally grazed. This is a picture of them on the rotational grazed pasture. We got about 25 acres of permanent pasture here for 25 cows. And this is taken after their first round about the middle of June. So the grass got ahead of me a little bit this year, but I find with rotational grazing, you get them around 2 or 3 times, they'll whittle that down even though it gets mature. And those are 2 sun shelter shades I've made out of grain bins, old grain bins. And they, as you can see by the picture, that wasn't a hot day, but they sure utilize it. And I found my conception rates are getting better because of providing the cows some shade. So this is my fencing tool. My son and daughter use this most of the time for putting up fence. We've got a side-by-side as well, but it doesn't work near as well as the four-wheeler because the roll guard's in the way for swinging posts on and off. We sit on this side saddle and we're able to roll the wire out at the same time as we're stepping in posts. Works really, really well. So after the pasture's done, right around Labor Day, we'll boot the cows back out on cover crop. This past year, we had to feed the cows for 2 weeks in a paddock on the pasture because we had very, very little rain in August, so the pasture dried up. So I've relegated to, instead of running them around the pasture, we'll lock them in one paddock. This year we locked them in a different paddock. I asked Kara, my daughter, which paddock was the poorest for grass. So that's the one we locked them in, and we fed them hay. And that should provide some increased fertility for that one paddock. And then we broadcast some cereal rye and some other stuff on that to get it going again, because then it started raining. We had some mud spots from the feeder. So this is the other side of that front hill. Last year I did some 60-inch corn. And as you can see in the 60-inch corn, that got a lot more cover, and it was interseeded when the corn was about just less than knee high. And it's amazing it did that well because we were really, really dry in 2020. And the corn yields were pretty comparable in the 60-inch compared to the 30-inch corn. The 60-inch corn was planted at 30,000 equivalent. So it was double planted basically in that 60-inch row. I meant to do it again this year, and the way the spring went, it didn't happen. I forgot. And even I didn't interseed any corn this year as well. It was a busy May and June. So this is a little tool I made for stepping in posts in December and January when it's froze. After I made this tool, I realized I could have used the cordless drill, but this slide hammer works pretty good. Just the 2 pins down here at the bottom are spaced the right space for the step-in post, and about 2 or 3 slams of that slide hammer, and then you put the post in the ground. Works pretty good. Ground gets really froze wherever you're driving buggy or combine. If you haven't drove on it, it doesn't freeze that bad. It's pretty good for getting posts in, but this alleviated the problem of getting fence up in the dead of winter. So last year I was able to make an arrangement with a neighbor I work with, put the cows on this field. First time livestock's been on that farm for probably 40 years. And that gave them an extra 3.5 weeks of grazing on corn stalks. And we just had step-in posts that had page wire along the Highway 24 there. Cows actually, touch wood, they never got out that winter. It was good. And we always fed them. To keep them a little bit trained, we take a gator over. Kara goes over and gives her horse a special treat. She's out with the cows all the time. So we take a half small square bale of hay, and the cows come walking towards the gator. So we kind of hope if the cows ever get out, they'll hear the sound of the gator and they'll come walking towards it. So proof to the pudding. Well, I got another slide. So this is my water source when the cows do get home. I've got a solar powered motion detected water bowl, and the water source is just the groundwater. That casing is about 12 feet deep. So that water bowl is in the middle of 3 fields. So I've always got wheat stubble or corn stalks in the middle of that, on one edge of that bowl. So that's my water, winter feeding. Winter water works excellent. So this is when we moved the cows home from that faraway field, hence the gator leading them, a little bit of hay in the back, and they're just following one by one. It was an actually pretty easy move until we got to a road. I've never heard this before, but one of the heifers did not want to cross that yellow line on the road. And when it took us about half an hour to get that one animal across that dotted line, and when she did, it was like she was walking on eggshells, tippy-toed right across the yellow line. The other aha moment when we moved the cows home that day is we couldn't get the cows off the roadside. They found that roadside grass really, really palatable. So this year I'm trying something different in the oats and peas that I've got too many oats and peas this year. So since I've fenced them off of some of the field, I'm going to save 20 acres for January grazing. I'm hoping they'll find that as palatable as the roadside grass instead of burning diesel fuel and wear and tear on the disc pine and the baler, wrapping oatlage, that maybe we can just graze it directly and get the manure spread easier that way. So this is, whenever I do feed hay, I'm always moving the feeder daily. So this is a rig I've come up with. The hay saver feeder's got rails underneath it for skis, got a loop of chain that's bolted to the loader bucket, and then a hook's welded to the feeder. So I just drop the chain into that hook and drag the feeder about 50 feet every day. So that's spreading my manure, and the cows will pick away at the hay that's left in the feeder and they'll bed it down. And I rarely have to do much with it. If I do, I'll maybe flip the harrows on the cultivator down lower and just harrow it in the spring before I plant to alleviate any poor emergence issues in those spots where I have the feeder. So switching to the cropping side, this is spreading manure on cover crop. Usually spread manure about Labor Day on any of my wheat stubble. I also have manure that'll go on
cereal rye, but I'm trying to spread all my manure on a living crop, hoping that that cover crop will utilize more nutrients, less chance of loss. With the high nitrogen prices now, I've got more manure to spread now, but I'm stockpiling in the field. It's going to make a heavier workload come spring, but I'm hoping we can utilize more of that nitrogen in the spring because of $800.28 that I'm hearing prices of. This is another picture. This is this past right around Labor Day, spreading about 5 tons of dry layer manure on cover crop. And you can see how good the chicken manure pattern, spreading pattern is of that spreader. Different moisture levels will change the spread pattern, and you can see streaks. If it's drier manure, it doesn't throw near as far. I've got my spread pattern for 30 feet for this vertical beater spreader. Works pretty good for the wetter stuff. So this is my corn planter setup, planting into cover crop. This actually might be a custom job of planting into some cover crop weeds, but it seems to do a good job. We've got dry starter on the planter for planting corn. I don't have dry starter on the bean planter. It's a similar setup. But this is planting into, field was actually harvested for oatlage a year ago, and the radishes all went to seed. Pollinators were really busy in this field. The buzz was almost unbelievable planting into that. And I just harvested that field of corn, most of that field of corn the other day, and it was well over 200 with limited nitrogen and excellent stand. Works really, really well in my system. And this is one of the first years I've started with cover crop. This is planting into cereal rye. The one thing there's lots of people out there saying it doesn't work to plant corn into cereal rye. I think you need downforce management. You need early season nitrogen is one of the two things I find you really need. And don't let the cereal rye get out and head. If it gets out and head, I think you're a little too late. Hard to terminate, and it's gone from vegetative to reproductive, and that vegetative tissue is really hard. It's a real carbon penalty. You'll need more nitrogen even yet. So this is my planter setup. It's a Kinsey planter. I've got hydraulic downforce on the row unit. I've got clean sweep up front, and I've changed my treader wheels that I've filled the grooves in because I was finding they'd mud up. These don't mud up near as much. I couldn't find plastic ones. Apparently there's plastic ones now available. I'd love to be able to, but these work actually pretty well. In an ideal world now, I'd have a trash whipper that's not mounted on the unit. It'd be mounted on the frame. I change my seed discs yearly. Okay? Every year, that's a job in the spring to replace them. I don't care if they're 3/4 wore out, replace them because of they've got to be sharp and new. And then I'm using spaded closing wheels. The far ones are steel Dawn, what do they call them? They're a spoked wheel, dimple wheel they call it. Dawn dimple wheel, and then this side's a Yetter wheel that goes on in place of the rubber. And I find them both do a good job. The steel ones are a little better. You don't have to use near as much downforce, one notch less for getting the trench closed, but I find that works really, really well. So cereal rye after corn stalks are combined. I tried this combination a few years ago to see if there was a difference. My spread pattern is 45 feet with that spreader. The roller was 30. I did not see a difference where it was rolled versus not rolled. So now that was a neighbor's roller I borrowed. So now I'm just spreading cereal rye after the corn. It seems to work really, really well at that 40 to 50 pound per acre rate. And I'll spread it. I've done it even in January. This is actually a picture from the first year after I attended Soil Smart. I asked Ray Archuleta personally after the meeting, I haven't got any cover crop. How do I start? He said, go spread some cereal rye in March. So I did that. And this is me planting beans before I got my bean planter. This is with the no-till drill. And where I had spread cereal rye, there was definitely less trash to deal with planting. Just it accelerated the microbiology to break down some of that trash. And this is on rented ground away from where there'd be livestock. This is another way of harvest managing cover crop, is to remove it and bale it and store it for feed. I haven't been using fungicide. Yes, I get more growth, but man, the cows still go after those oats that are covered in rust. So it's not, but doing this burns a pile of fuel, and then you're raking it and you're baling it and you're wrapping it. It's a lot of work to make oatlage. This is one way I thought I was doing a good thing. I mowed my cover crop, but it created a lot of slug pressure. I still don't deal with as many slugs now as I used to. I think a slug issue is a part of the getting over the hurdle with your soil health. As your soil health and your microbiology gets more in balance, your slug pressure should minimize. But doing this made a real problem. I had to actually replant corn in this field where I mowed the cover crop down. Plus that takes a pile of fuel. My analogy was, in the day, a fence post rots out at the ground where it's on the ground. So I figured, let's get that cover crop on the ground where it'll rot quicker, but it just created a slug habitat. We do utilize Y dropping for nitrogen management in our corn. So we're putting the nitrogen on the corn when we need it. I just made those Y drops myself. Works really, really well. And also for residue management, this is the year I'm still running a 1980s 843 corn head with calmer rolls. And before I made the big investment of all 8 rows on the 8-row head, I did 2 on each side of the head. So these 4 rows on the left side of the head are chopped versus the 4 on the right side are not. You can see a difference here, but where the difference really shows up is in the spring or the following fall when you're planting wheat into soybean stubble. The stalks where they're chopped are virtually gone, where you can still find, I'll call them logs of stalks where you haven't chopped them. So I think you take less of a carbon penalty on your wheat when you're putting nitrogen on the following spring in your wheat crop 2 years after the corn crop. So I use the analogy of make your residue the size that earthworms can eat. And if your microbiology can eat it, it'll be consumed and add to that food for your microbiology. So this is the same farm that James took the video on where the cows were. This is another, that was another aha moment. That was after a 3-inch rain in about an hour. And I planted that field a day prior to that rain. And the water was only sitting where the trash whippers had ran. So trash whippers was enough tillage to reduce the infiltration of the soil. In between the rows, there was no water land. It was enlightening. So if I'd worked the whole field, I would have water laying on the whole field and running off. It wasn't enough to cause me any erosion or wash out my rows. In my no-till journey of back before soil health wasn't a thing, we had no-till coulters on my corn planter, and they ended up doing too much tillage. We were doing strip tillage, in essence, on the front of the planter, and we were washing out corn rows on our hills. This isn't enough. I think my soil health is better now. It's not washing out, but it was another aha moment of this is why we're doing what we're doing. This is taken this past summer in my back field where these are black beans. We had 3.5 inches of rain in about an hour. So this is, probably 15 acres come down through here. We didn't lose any soil, a little bit of soil moved, but we certainly lost a lot of trash. All my corn residue washed through there. We lost some of these beans right in here, but for a 3.5-inch rain in an hour, I was pretty pleasantly surprised. So I know we're going on the right path, and it's all for this, the next generation. This is Ethan driving grain buggy on an early Saturday morning 2 years ago, trying to get the corn off. The other day he was driving combine, getting him in that seat now. And this is Kara in the grain buggy, and I'm driving combine doing wheat. So with that, that's why we're doing what we're doing for the next generation, to try and make our soil healthy and able to feed the cows as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Steve. We just have about a minute, but there were some questions in the chat that maybe we can get you to answer very quickly before we move to Dr. Drewnoski. So, Steve, there are a couple of people wondering about what was in that cover crop mix in the 60-inch corn. So was there annual ryegrass in there, or what else was in that mix?
Annual ryegrass, crimson clover, tillage radish. That was the main three.
Perfect, thanks. And the one other quick question was whether it was strip tilled or not.
The only strip tillage is what's done right on the planter with just the trash whippers. That's my form of strip tillage.
Perfect. Thanks, Steve. Again, thanks very much, Steve, and we're looking forward to chatting with you a bit more in about half an hour's time. So our second speaker is Dr. Mary Drewnoski. So Dr. Drewnoski is a beef systems specialist with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She's a beef cattle nutritionist with expertise in forage-based production systems and is part of an interdisciplinary team evaluating economical systems for integrated crop and livestock production in Nebraska. She spent the last 8 years researching and providing education on the use of crop residues and cover crop forage for backgrounding calves and feeding beef cows. So Dr. Drewnoski, thanks for joining us, and I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Oh, well, thanks for inviting me. I think I learned a lot from Steve, and I had a lot of similar experiences with using cattle on corn residue as well as on cover crops. And today I was asked, of course, to talk about the impacts of grazing cover crops on the soil. And as you heard from my introduction, I am a ruminant nutritionist by training. When I got here, I was kind of tasked with working on these integrated crop livestock systems. And one of the big questions was about the soil. So I teamed up with a soil scientist. Unfortunately, our soil scientist is a researcher first and doesn't really like to give presentations. So I kind of took on that role. So you'll have to bear with me in terms of, I'll give you my understanding of what we're seeing and my interpretation based off of what I have learned. I'll tell you one of the cool things about the soil is that it is very similar to the rumen in that it's all about carbon to nitrogen ratios and it's all about feeding the microbes. So once I learned that, I was like, oh, this isn't so bad. I can actually understand what's going on. Okay, so the first thing I really wanted to talk about, because this is probably one of the #1 questions that I get, is really about grazing cover crops and the effect on soil organic matter. And one of the really cool things that I think people underestimate is just how much the roots are contributing to soil organic matter. So this is an example of oats, and for me, late planted oats is a pretty common, late summer planted oats is pretty common in our area. So we would be planting, after wheat, but we wouldn't be planting till the 1st of August. And in that situation, we have a really highly digestible, so high energy feed stuff, but that has some downsides from the standpoint of that means that the carbon is actually being digested and absorbed by the animal and going off as CO2 rather than coming out the back end, right? So the lower digestibility, the more it's coming out the back end. The cool thing is that if we look at the plant and think about contribution to soil stable carbon or organic matter, we see that we have about 50% of the biomass on the oats in our situation being coming from the roots and 50% of the biomass being produced in the top matter. So that above ground, the forage. So one of the interesting things though, is that because the below ground biomass or the roots actually contribute more to soil stable organic matter, we don't see nearly as big of an effect of grazing as you might expect, especially in these situations where we're stockpiling the forage or allowing it to grow and then using it really later in the season versus grazing it during the season. However, I should point out that unless we graze really early, we don't see nearly the same effects on annuals as we do on perennials in terms of effects on root growth. Perennials, you'll see them, you take off some top growth, you'll see them actually remove some root growth, but we don't really see quite that same system with annuals, likely because their goals are different, right? Perennials are trying to maintain that plant for multiple years, and annuals, their whole goal in life is just to produce seed. So if we look at kind of the contributions, we have about 70% of the contribution of soil stable organic matter coming from the roots if we're not grazing, and about 30% from the top. And in this situation where I said I had a ton of dry matter, which is not quite a ton of organic matter, and it's about 1,000 pounds of carbon, we're getting about 500 pounds of carbon. If we graze, and we graze off 70% of the material, and by the way, I say 70% of the material being consumed, and let's be realistic, that's if you have 70% disappearing, they're not consuming all 70%. But I did kind of the worst case scenario here. So we said 70% is being consumed. Because it's highly digestible, we only have a small fraction coming out the back end as carbon, right? So they consumed about 600 pounds of carbon, and they treated about a little less than 200 pounds of carbon. The cool thing, though, is that manure itself, because of the carbon to nitrogen ratio and because of the microbes, it actually contributes more per amount of carbon to soil stable organic matter, actually about double than what that top material would. So we don't lose nearly as much as you might think. So in this situation, grazing 70% of the oats, we still captured 90% of the soil stable organic matter. And that does not account for any effects that grazing and that trampling is having on incorporating the rest of that material into the soil. So, and it doesn't account for the fact that we do change some of the microbial population, which changes our nutrient cycling. But the long story short is we just don't see the effect that a lot of people would think, which is they think, oh, if we take this off, we're removing it. And so we're not going to get nearly the benefits. Most of the benefits coming from the roots, and we're not changing that. The other thing that I want to point out, which was kind of an aha moment for me, was that the above ground biomass, especially on these winter hardy species, doesn't tell you about what's going on below ground. And so one of the cool things is we had rye planted after soybeans, and we went and took soil cores, and I was really surprised. 3-inch tall rye, and we're getting 30-inch root growth. So they're putting a lot of, especially winter hardy ones, they're putting a lot of growth early in their growth into those roots because they're trying to be able to make it through that winter period. And so the looks can be deceiving on what's going on the top versus what's happening on the bottom, which is kind of neat. And I wouldn't have believed you if you'd told me that if I didn't see it myself. So I'm going to talk about corn residue for just a second, mainly because I want to use it as an example, because it's one of the longest term studies that we have in terms of impacts of grazing. And I think that's important. So we've done studies all across Nebraska, and we have quite the precipitation gradient. Eastern Nebraska, which is where I'm going to talk about pretty much all of my data, would be kind of on the driest end of your region. However, we go from about 32 to 35 inches out to about 16 to 12 inches in the very driest part of Nebraska. So we've kind of done some studies across the gradients, and we really see very similar effects in terms of grazing corn residue. So I'm just going to stick with one, which is the long-term 16-year study where we grazed residue either in the fall or the spring, or we didn't graze it. And so the first question we always get is about compaction. And so I'm going to set this up for you here just a second. We have different depths in the soil. So this is the top of the soil going down 2 inches, going down 4, 6, and 8 inches into our soil. And by the way, in Nebraska, that's really our soil depth for most of our rooting depth. And that's actually how we sample when we're looking at nutrients, just so you know. So we go down to 8 inches. And then this is bulk density. So basically this tells you about the porosity of the soil. And then what we have is we have in the triangles, we have fall grazing, spring grazing. So this is happening in February through about the end of March. And so for us, the ground is typically thawed for at least 75% of that time period, and we start getting rain. So it is kind of the worst case scenario. And then we have a control where we didn't graze. And this is in a corn soybean rotation, and we only graze after the corn. But what we see is we do see with the spring grazing, maybe a trend for an increase in bulk density. It's a very small change across here. And in fact, so we couldn't even pick it up statistically. But here's what I really wanted to point out. We're really just pushing the edge where we might suspect that we would see an effect on root growth. So that's kind of our threshold for this soil type. With the spring grazing, with the fall grazing, you can see, if anything, we have no effect. And in fact, these numbers that are getting close is actually the fall versus the spring grazing, which is kind of interesting. So we really not seeing a bunch of changes in bulk density. This is 16 years. I should point out that this is only in a no-till system. The first 10 years, we had other treatments, and I don't have the soil data on it, but we had with spring tillage, and we had one where it was ridge till. We did not see any interactions with grazing and type of tillage. Basically, the effects were the same regardless. So after the first 10 years, we just switched everything to no-till, and I only sampled from the no-till here. So if we look at penetration resistance, which honestly, I think this is the reason why a lot of farmers believe that they're seeing compaction, we do see a bigger change here in terms of penetration resistance. So that's basically the force it takes to go through the soil. And there's a couple things that happen, one of which is that if we take off residue and then we measure penetration resistance, sometimes we have more evaporative losses because we took off residue, and so the soil will be a little bit drier, and that of course means that it'll take more force to go through the soil, and that's kind of what we see at the surface. We also see here, if you look again, spring grazing had more of an effect than our fall grazing, which really had no effect, and again that's because most of that grazing occurs when the ground is frozen, so it's kind of expected. But we still are way below the threshold where we would expect to see impacts on root growth. Here's what's really neat to me is that when we look at the yields of the subsequent soybeans, and then of course we follow corn as well, what we see is that we actually see a benefit in both our soybean and our corn yield if we grazed. So these were really high producing fields. They were, as you can see, 200 bushel an acre corn. So of course, removing some of that residue and getting that carbon and nitrogen ratio a little bit lower helped us out, especially on the soybeans, but even we can see it on the corn. So in fact, we saw a positive response, and the question was why, right? What's going on here? And when we looked at the microbial community, we see that we get, with fall grazing and spring grazing, we get an increase in the total microbes in the soil, which kind of makes sense. It's a lot what Steve was talking about. We're just revving up the biology in the soil. And it was really neat that the two classes that really changed, one was the actinomycete bacteria, and the other one was the saprophytic fungi. Both of those guys like to eat hard to degrade carbon material. So they like to eat residue, and we increased both of those populations. So we're cycling our residue a little bit faster. This is a real positive in a high yielding field. It's definitely a real positive in some wetter situations. It can be a negative in really dry situations. So some of our lower yielding fields where we get really dry, which again is not where you guys are sitting, we can see some challenges with getting too dry if we remove too much residue. But honestly, in most situations where we have decent yields, we actually see some real positives of having this happen. Now, what happened to organic matter? We didn't see any effects on organic matter. If anything, it's an upward trend, not a downward trend. By grazing, and that might partially be because we were changing that nutrient cycling. This wasn't statistically different, but you can kind of see it's going up, which is kind of neat. So bottom line, soil compaction, we really don't see anything on porosity of the soil. We do see across all of our trials some increases in penetration resistance, always below any kind of threshold that would affect the next plant. And it seems like when we measure from year to year, we don't see any carryover. And when we kind of measure later in the season, so most of these were taken in April, like as soon as we pulled the spring graze cattle, right before we would plant our next crop, we'll see some of those changes in penetration resistance. If we come back in 2 months, we can't pick them up anymore. So just the wet dry cycles and the microbial activity alleviates anything that we're seeing, especially because most of that's happening in that really shallow depth. We don't see, I didn't show you the data, but we looked at wind erosion, soil fertility, and we just don't see any kind of real impacts, which is kind of neat. It's not something, I still have to convince a lot of our farmers that having cattle out on the cropland is not a bad thing. But I'll show you some other reasons why I think they might be concerned. I think the number one is, of course, if you graze in the spring, and for us, when the ground is thawed, it's combined with the same time where we have a bunch of moisture, we can get really high pugging. So we can get a really rough surface. And if they experience that, they don't like it, right? Because you got to slow down on how fast you can plant, and that's not fun. So they get pushed back because of that. In the eastern part of Nebraska, we don't have nearly as many cows. We have a lot of cropland. And in the western part where we have more cows, they have figured it out, you know, and they do more integration. So a lot of the work I do is really in the eastern part of the state. So I wanted to show you one other example. This is a little bit dry for you guys, but there's a couple reasons why I wanted to show you the data. So this was a cool season mix after wheat. The main reason we planted a cool season mix after wheat was not because we didn't have enough growing degree days to do a warm season. We could have, but they're in a limited water situation. So we were trying to find something that didn't use quite as much water. But we had something that was basically mostly some volunteer wheat came back. He didn't get it all killed off. He tried. He didn't work as well as we would have hoped, but also triticale. And then, of course, the brassicas. And I will say that's what we see pretty consistently with these mixes is the brassicas and the grasses really do dominate regardless of our seeding rates. One of the things we did was they grazed with first calf heifers. They only got about 22 days of grazing. It was about 2.4 AUMs per acre. An AUM is a 1,000-pound cow, basically. So an AUM would be a 1,000-pound cow for a month. And it came out to be about a cost of $62 an acre or about $26 an AUM, which is a lot cheaper than what our pasture costs are. So he was very happy. Oh, what's the clay content of soils in Nebraska? I think the answer will be much like Ontario. It depends. The soil I just showed you, which was the corn residue field, it was a silt clay loam. And if I remember correctly, it was only about, I think it was 20 or 30% clay. So it wasn't a really high clay soil. We do have some, but it really kind of depends on where you're at. This field is actually quite high clay, the one where we were grazing after wheat. So one of the things I wanted to show you is that this is the part that he grazed. So he grazed this biomass basically until December, and this is the ungrazed versus the grazed. So we actually kind of compared the two, and this is kind of what it looked like in April before we went in and planted corn. This is how much biomass was left of the post-grazed material. By June, you couldn't even find residue anymore. So that was actually a little bit of a problem in this particular situation. But I wanted to show you a couple things here. Remember, they only grazed for 28 days. This was only 1 year. Manure got applied to the whole field before they planted the cover crops. So they already kind of ramped up some of the microbial activity. But I wanted to point out this total biomass on the microbes. And again, you see the cover crop increased the microbial biomass in the soil, and grazing didn't negate it. And in fact, I have some studies, which I actually was having a hard time finding the data, so I didn't put it on here, but I have some studies where if we don't have manure in the system and we put a cover crop and then we graze them, we do see an increase beyond the just the cover crop alone in the total microbial biomass. In particular, what we tend to see is some change in the fungi, and then of course a little bit of change in the microbial biomass. And again, you can kind of see here where the cover crop was, regardless of whether it was grazed, we see a ramp up in the total bacteria, which can be really great. In this case, that was part of a challenge in that we ended up having some challenges with the amount of moisture that we had in the soil for the subsequent crop. So as I said, this stuff, the cover crop was planted in August, and we typically have killing frosts usually in November. So in this situation, I think he planted like August 1st in, I was trying to remember this year, probably November 1st would have been when we would have gotten it winter killed. So we actually didn't turn out until really December, and that was just mainly because that was good timing for when he needed some forage. I will tell you that the quality of that stuff maintains very well into the winter, so I don't have a problem delaying grazing. So key takeaways, the microbial degradation is typically increased when we're grazing. Contact with the soil, I think that's an interesting question. Like, how much of that is from manure? How much of that is from getting more of the material in contact with the soil and stimulating those microbes to be able to take use of it? I get a lot of questions about removing 50%. What should my target be in terms of how much residue do I need to leave on the soil? And I will tell you that my thought process is I target amount of cover that I want to leave, and I don't really worry about how much I'm actually grazing in terms of the biomass. So if I have a lot of biomass, I take a lot more, and if I have a little, I take a lot less, so that I get enough to maintain that cover so I don't have erosion. And that's typically, a lot of times we only need, especially in flatter situations, you'd be surprised at what 2 inches of stubble will do for you in terms of keeping our erosion down. So I wanted to show you another study, which I just kind of threw in here, mainly because I wanted to talk a little bit about what happens in terms of the nitrogen in that cover crop. So this study was, again, it was planted after wheat, and it was planted August 15th. And they had a smorgasbord of stuff in here. But one of the reasons why it's planted so late after wheat for us is really just because they baled the straw and then they went and applied liquid manure. And that was actually, they were putting on this manure for the corn crop for the next year. So this is a lot of N that they applied. And then they planted a crop and we grazed it. Can you say nitrates? Because I can. But the kind of cool thing about this is that when they planted it, they had oats, sorghum, and they had quite a bit of, as you can see, they had almost 6 pounds of brassicas, 3 pounds of radish, and 3 pounds of purple top turnip. In terms of the yield, the big yield producers, as would make sense, would have been the oats because it was too cool really for the sorghum to do much. And then the brassicas did really, really well, which is also kind of expected. In fact, they did too well. There was a lot of brassica out there. We needed a little bit more grass to have some more fiber in their diets. And I can show you just, I think, here, let me throw it up there. That's what the calves look like while they were grazing this stuff. They were very, very loose. But they did figure out how to graze brassicas, I will tell you that at first, right, they go through and they do tend to select the oats, but once they figure out the brassicas are pretty good, they actually make use of it. So in this case, we got about 2 tons of forage per acre. We did continuously graze, so we just basically gave them the access to the whole field. And I'll tell you that I think that's a bit of a mistake from a forage utilization standpoint. We tend not to do that as much anymore. But we had about 1.7 head per acre out there, and they gained about 1.5 pounds. So that was pretty good. We can get about 2 pounds if we get the right amount of grass in the mix. But what I really showed you this for was for the yield. And I wanted to show you, this was a subsequent corn yield. And compared to the control where there was no cover crop, we did have a yield drop where we had the cover crop. And that was just because it took up a lot of that nitrogen, and then it was tied up when the corn really was looking for it early in the season. Even with all those brassicas, which I usually think of brassicas as being fairly quick to degrade in the spring. But where we grazed it, we recovered most of that yield drag. And remember, we didn't add any additional nitrogen. So this is all just about nitrogen availability and when it was available. And I thought that was pretty interesting because that's a real advantage for grazing, especially if you're planting a cover crop and then you want to have that nitrogen available for the subsequent crop, because it just speeds up that cycling. Now, I wanted to talk about, because I sound like I think grazing is the answer for all of our problems. And I really like grazing. I'm a ruminant nutritionist. I'm all about the beef. But there are some negatives that we see sometimes if we don't manage our grazing correctly. And one of those is the water infiltration and the effects that grazing can have on our water infiltration. I think partially because we can have them if they're in contact with bare soil a lot. We can get them breaking off some small pieces of soil and actually clogging up some of our pores that we've made. So it can have some short-term effects on water infiltration in the spring. So this is actually some spring grazing of cereal rye. This study, as you can see, we grazed it hard. This is probably the most growth we had post-grazing. There was some parts of the field where it was grazed to the ground. To be honest, they stayed out too long. And you can see in that situation, we went from where we didn't have cover crop to adding cover crop. We see no differences in water infiltration, but where we grazed, we had a huge decline in infiltration rate. And that's just because we did have a lot of bare soil, and they probably did end up working up a lot of that really small particles. I will say one positive is we tend to see increases in aggregate stability. So we actually still reduce our wind and water erosion, but we do have some challenges with infiltration rate. This is a different location. This is farther south, and they were more moderate in their grazing. This is actually what it looked like where it wasn't grazed, and this is what it looked like where it was grazed. And again, we kind of see where grazing, basically in this case, we had some positive effects of putting that cover crop in there. This was rye after corn silage. And where we grazed, we kind of brought that back down in terms of infiltration rates back to where we didn't have cover crop. So that's, not exciting, right, as somebody who likes grazing, but it is some reality that we tend to see if we don't have a lot of residual material on the soil. In this case, they had no protection other than the rye because it was corn silage. Another one that we did with corn silage is early harvest of corn silage. We can plant oats. It's pretty, you got to be timing. It's got to be right for us, because even for us, there's not a lot of growing degree days left. And so this was usually we're planting about September 1, and that's kind of the edge of not being able to do it. I did want to show you, this is kind of how much growth we can get. And this is pretty close to what it looks like when they're done. So you can see we utilize it really well, maybe a little bit too much. And in fact, sometimes it's even better than that. And we again kind of see that the non-grazed cover crop improved our infiltration rates, and grazing kind of brought it back down to where we would see our no cover crop situation. So this particular study, basically both of these fields had about 3 years of grazing. It was in a corn soybean rotation, and this was after silage. We would put in oats and we wouldn't graze after soybeans. So there are some differences across fields in some of our measurements, but overall we kind of see the same thing where maybe we don't get the positive effect on infiltration rate of the cover crop. If we looked at the amount of soil cover, depending on the field and then just how much growth we got, we see that having that cover crop improved it in the west field. We didn't see that in the east field, and that's just tends to be based off of what year we planted and when we were able to get the silage off. But I think it's kind of interesting to see that even with the amount of residual cover, and this is in early June, and that's another thing I should point out. One of the interesting things that I've seen in these fields where we had oat cover crop multiple years is that the longer we went into this situation, the less and less residual we had, even in the non-grazed cover crop, because we were stimulating that microbiology. And so it was almost like we needed more carbon. This was a very low carbon system in general, right? Because corn silage and soybeans, you don't get much carbon. So in my mind, going into a rotation where we had more carbon would have been beneficial. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to show you is, again, we didn't see any real increases in wind erodible fraction when we grazed. And so we see that pretty consistently across all of our trials. So long story short, there's advantages to grazing. There's a few disadvantages to grazing. The big one for me, we get some extra money from cover crop, right? And that's because we use it as a forage source. We do see increased microbial activity in most situations. I would say if we have a lot of manure application and short grazing durations, you may not be able to pick it up. We do see increased aggregate stability. I didn't show you that data, but we pretty much consistently see that. We do negate the infiltration benefits of having that cover crop, and we can decrease soil cover. And so grazing management for both of those is key, right? Having enough residual on the soil to buffer things is really important. We retain our organic matter benefits, and we don't really see compaction. So in my mind, I think the trade-offs are still in favor of grazing. So in terms of other questions that come up, need sheep, not cows. Yeah, so that's funny. I think we have a really hard time convincing people to have sheep in Nebraska. It is the beef state, so it's pretty popular to have cattle. But there are some advantages, of course, to having sheep. So I think it would be really interesting to see how much of those negative effects you could eliminate if you had sheep. Of course, you still got to manage grazing because those buggers can graze it even harder. I don't know if there's any other questions or if we want to go to the chat.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mary. That was fantastic, and thanks so much to both Steve and Mary for the information that they provided. I think we're gonna have a great conversation in the next 20 minutes or so to dig into some of that information. I think it was really complimentary. We just kind of, I think, had some of the numbers really put to some of Steve's experiences. So there's lots to dig into there. Thank you to BFO and OSF again for supporting this series, and not only this year, but in the past number of years where we've run it. Just a reminder, the slide's going to come up in a moment, but this was part 2 of our 3-part series. So please join us next Tuesday, November 23rd, for the final session of our Grazing Cover Crop webinar series. So next Tuesday, there you can see it. We're going to be joined by Matthew Flugel of Hastings County, and as well as Liz Fugel and Dr. Richard Earhart, a small ruminant specialist with Michigan State University, who's going to speak on cover crops as a lamb finishing system. So we're going to build on basically what we've had for each of these 3 series with a producer paired with a researcher, which I think has worked really well so far.